Gaius Claudius Pulcher, Praetor 56 BCE. The fourth most famous child of the patrician consul of 79, Gaius Claudius Pulcher grew up with 5 siblings, all of whom survived to adulthood. Unlike some senatorial families in the late Republic, who found themselves torn asunder by the politics of the era, the Claudians remained tight-knit. Lacking the beauty of his sister Clodia, the supercilious and superstitious tendencies of Appius, and the dynamic daring and love of controversy of Publius, Gaius was a great deal less colorful than most of his relatives. However, as a Claudian and an office holder, Gaius played a role in the political machinations of both of his brothers, and he was an asset in his own right for the first Triumvirate. With Publius murdered and Appius governing a province, Gaius showed his political weakness by falling prey to what was, by now, a standard-issue charge for extortion. Unable to pay once he was inevitably convicted, for circumstances we'll get into that are kind of funny, he entered exile voluntarily, and does not seem to have ever returned, although we know that he lived until at least 43. However, since his eldest brother Appius died without a male heir, Gaius's son was adopted and became the bearer of the storied name Appius Claudius Pulcher. By accepting his uncle's offer of adoption and becoming Appius Claudius Pulcher, the boy who was once Gaius Jr. abandoned literally nothing of value. Gens Claudia is incontrovertibly the most successful political family in the history of Rome. If you look at almost the entire history of the Republic, from about 10 years into the Republic when Aetius Clausus, the Sabine leader, defected with his followers and hence became Appius Claudius, and you go all the way to the close of the Republic, you see that the name Appius Claudius is extraordinarily well represented among the consuls. And even when you don't have an Appius Claudius, you often have a Publius or a Gaius Claudius. So we won't really go through the family's history. It's a name that everybody knows. Even if you've only read one book on Rome in your entire life, you're familiar with the name. And the Pulcher branch, by this point in Rome's history, was the most prominent surviving branch. Pulcher, by the way, means handsome or attractive. So Gaius' father was Appius Claudius Pulcher, a man who served as consul in 79. He was a dedicated Solon, unlike his own father, who was actually a backer of Tiberius Gracchus. Gaius became the second child, most likely. He was born in 96. We don't know for sure the birth order of the children, but the most common guess is that Appius was born in 97, then Gaius in 96, Publius in 92, and the sisters in between. There are some who think that his eldest sister, Clodius Metelli, was actually older than Appius or Gaius, and that she came from a previous marriage. But we simply don't know, and it isn't super important, so we'll just pass it over. As for what his famous siblings went on to do, his eldest brother Appius went on to become consul in 54 and then became censor in 50. We'll talk about him at a later date. He actually plays a pretty big role in the breakdown of relations between Caesar and Pompey. The youngest of the 3 brothers is almost certainly the most famous of the whole group, and that would be Publius Clodius Pulcher. He, of course, was famously adopted as a plebeian, served as a tribune, and then was engaged in a lot of street violence until his own death at the hands of Milo in the later half of the 50s. And of the 3 sisters, one of them became pretty well known in Rome, and that would be Clodia Metelli, the eldest of the sisters. So she would be immortalized by both the poet Catullus, who was deeply in love with her, and by Cicero, who attempted to smear her reputation. That being said, while we know quite a bit about her relationship with Publius, since they were rather close, we don't know a whole lot about her interactions with Gaius or even Appius. But from what we do know, all of the siblings were rather close, even if only the relationship between Clodia and Publius came under scrutiny from Cicero, who of course famously accused them of incest. Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey formed the first Triumvirate in 60 in order to override the obstructionism of the Optimates. This was a pretty big moment in Roman history, as this was kind of a way to get around obstructionism without really changing anything legally. The first triumvirate, of course, didn't have any legal standing. It was more of an informal thing that would rely upon patronage and just an agreement, a kind of handshake deal among three power brokers and their various lackeys. Speaking of lackeys, in order to get bills passed and protect themselves from prosecution, the triumvirs would need a number of junior magistrates to come along to help them out. And luckily for them, Appius Claudius Pulcher was looking to get himself and his two younger brothers into high office, and he thought that serving the triumvirate would be the best vehicle to get that done. And so he went to the triumvirs and told them that both he and his brothers were ready to serve. This also means, of course, that Gaius was brought along with his brother, and he would actually show up in Gaul as a legate of Caesar during the war's first year in 58. Apparently, soldiering was not for him, as he did not remain. He easily could have stayed another year had he been so inclined, but perhaps he simply wanted to focus on running for Praetor. He never went back after he was done either, it's worth mentioning. Another thing to keep in mind, because Gaius is not the loudest personality among his brothers, he does not come into as much personal conflict with other senators. And we see that in how Cicero talks about him in his letters, because he does mention Gaius once in a while, but it's typically in a neutral way. He doesn't really have that strong of an opinion on Gaius, even though he absolutely hates Publius, and he's not that big of a fan of Appius either. One of the ways in which young men could gain a reputation was to go after older politicians and try to diminish their legacy in some way. And that was really the origin of Publius Clodius's rivalry with Cicero. What had happened is that back in 63, Cicero had executed a number of Roman citizens without a trial because he said they were involved in the Catilinarian conspiracy, and he declared a state of emergency and put them to death. Well, 5 years later, Claudius, as tribune, had the People's Assembly vote to send Cicero into exile. So for about a year and a half or so, Cicero was unable to be in Rome. A few years later, he was able to come back. But when he did, Claudius was not willing to let things go at that. He and Cicero, by this point, deeply and genuinely hated each other, and Claudius wanted to make sure that Cicero suffered as much as possible. He also wanted to make sure that his achievement stood for as long as possible. One of the things that Claudius had done back when he had gotten Cicero exiled was to make sure that his land was confiscated in Rome, that his house was demolished, and a shrine was erected in its place. And so the new project that Publius had in mind was to prevent Cicero from reclaiming the land and rebuilding his house. Gaius, as the praetor that year, was actually in a better position than Publius to make sure that this came to pass. And so Gaius would gather up men and prevent Cicero's supporters from removing the placards at the site. But it was very clear that this was Publius's doing. He was most likely present in person and spoke about it when he was able. Yet Gaius was the guy actually carrying this out, but Cicero and everyone else understood that Publius was the mastermind. What ended up happening in the end was that Publius had to leave town for some reason, and while he was gone, Cicero went back and finally succeeded in removing the placards and beginning reconstruction. So it's possible either that Gaius did not want to keep doing his brother's dirty work, that he was unmotivated, or that he received orders from on high from some of the triumvirs who were a little bit more lenient to Cicero, that it was time to let this drop. At any rate, we see that Gaius was, at least in this instance, simply carrying out the orders and wishes of others and not really showing a lot of agency. Although Gaius Claudius Pulcher was not the strongest personality in Rome, he was a fairly lucky guy up to this point. Not only had he been born rich and famous, but he also was able to secure a proconsular governorship rather than a mere pro-praetorian governorship. The significance of this is that the province that he received, Asia, not only had a proconsular rating, but also was incredibly wealthy. Not to mention that at the time it wasn't at war. So this was a perfect opportunity for Gaius to make some money and prepare himself to run for consul in a couple of years. Of all the assignments he could have wished for as a pro-praetorian governor, this was literally hitting the jackpot. And in fact, Gaius seems to have been fairly content with this assignment, as he should have been. That being said, most likely his reason for remaining here as long as he did was not that he simply loved Asia and he felt like he had an obligation to the people there to continue governing, but rather because he looked at the situation in Rome and realized that he was not likely to win the consulship if he were to return home and start campaigning. What he was looking at was the infamous four-way race, where all four candidates were just about equally strong, and there was really no way to predict who might win. He was being informed of all this by his brother Appius, who was the sitting consul of 54. And Gaius wasn't really liking what he was hearing, so he decided to simply remain in Asia and keep lining his pockets. In the summer of 54, Gaius Claudius Pulcher was not a candidate for consul in the following year. However, there's every reason to believe that he was very seriously considering it right up until the last minute. And the strongest piece of circumstantial evidence is that his elder brother Appius Claudius Pulcher, the consul of the year 54, took time out of his busy schedule to prosecute the leading patrician candidate for 53, Marcus Aemilius Scaurus. There's a very good reason why the two Claudian brothers targeted this man. Even though the prosecution failed, one has to imagine that Appius was rather pissed off when his brother told him that he would not run after all, after the groundwork that Appius had tried to lay for him. As we'll see in a minute, though, not only was Gaius's caution rather smart due to the nature of the race in that year, but also he would miss out on literally the biggest political scandal of the decade, which is saying a lot. So the reason why Gaius was so unenthusiastic about running that year is because a recent law had made things a little bit more difficult for patricians. So before this, there was a guaranteed spot for the patrician and a guaranteed spot for a plebeian. And since there were fewer patricians, that was a built-in advantage for them. But now things had reversed. So it was necessary for a patrician not only to beat the other patricians, but to genuinely finish first or second to actually get a spot. Because it was now possible for a plebeian to take both spots. So if there were 5 candidates and the top 2 vote-getters were plebeians, both of them would be the consuls. If the top 2 were patricians, only the top vote-getter would get the consulship, and the second slot would go to the highest ranking or highest vote-receiving plebeian. So this meant that Gaius knew, as a matter of fact, he not only had to beat Scaurus, but he would also need to be able to beat at least all but one of the other candidates. And so he maybe felt a little bit intimidated by that, given that there were 4 strong candidates and no one really had a clue of who was in the lead. We also hear a little bit more about Gaius's political leanings at this time, as he was actually seriously considering following his younger brother's example and being adopted as a plebeian, because he thought that, due to the new election laws, that would be his best chance of becoming a consul. Of course, the patricians were very much just panicking because one of their sacred privileges had been impinged upon. It was not really that big of a threat, and a lot of modern surveys of ancient elections show that Roman voters tended to respond rather favorably to famous, especially patrician names. We also see, as governor, that Gaius had a visit from Cicero at one point, and as a guy who wants to be consul, he would definitely make sure to say hello if he knew that Cicero was passing through. Now, most likely, Cicero didn't really want to see Gaius because of the previous beef with Publius, and he also expressed his concern to Atticus that he might be forced to deal with Gaius's charm. This, of course, was meant sarcastically, but I don't think we should take it as necessarily an indication that Gaius was a bore or that he was a complete and total asshole, but rather as the fact that Cicero hated his brother and associated Gaius with him. The other thing to keep in mind is that perhaps Cicero just had it in for the whole family, and he sometimes would refer to Gaius as Claudius rather than Claudius, which most likely is a kind of subtle jab at the fact that he was following in his younger brother's footsteps to such an extent, and he looked to his younger brother for guidance, even though he was about 4 years older. But again, we are having to read into this a bit, and Cicero frankly didn't really care enough about Gaius to deeply explain the meaning of all of his jokes at his expense, the one or two jokes that there are. Gaius was vastly less talented than either of his two brothers. That's simply a fact. It's also a fact that due to the depth of his pockets and his famous family name, that he could have easily had a successful political career without either of them being around. Because of their presence, however, and their controversial natures, this meant that Gaius, just by proxy, had a lot of enemies in Rome, and these were not the kinds of enemies that he was equipped to deal with. We'll really see how he operates on his own once he is the only brother left in town. So in January of 52, famously Claudius was murdered during a scuffle with Titus Annius Milo on the Appian Way. This led to a renewed round of political crisis in Rome as Claudius's very angry followers burned down the Senate house. Appius, meanwhile, was sent away as governor of Cilicia, and so he was unavailable to help out. So this meant that Gaius was responsible now for conducting his own affairs, which is something that he clearly was not able to do given the kinds of enemies his brothers had made. Now, one thing that Gaius would have to deal with while they were gone, I guess Publius, of course, is permanently gone, but Appius temporarily, was to defend himself against an extortion charge. Pretty much every governor who went out faced one of these. This was more or less a standard issue thing, something that you could expect if you were the governor of anything, especially if you had a famous name. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, a common thing for young men to do was to create feuds with older men. So most likely the two guys who brought forward the suit against Gaius were relative nobodies on the come-up. So, rather than using the standard defense strategies of trying to bribe some of the jurors, or simply denying it, or defending his conduct by talking about some good things he did, Gaius decided instead to be too clever by half. So what he did was he suborned his former legate, Marcus Servilius, to put him up on lesser charges. And the idea here was to get those lesser charges to take away attention from the bigger charge of extortion. That didn't work. It also could be that the thinking on Gaius's part was that he might be able to establish an alibi. So if he knew what the charge would be for the serious charge, if he pled guilty to something minor, that might help him establish an alibi that he could cite. I don't know exactly what he was thinking, but again, it was a little bit too clever by half. And the biggest part of the problem is that the guy he was trying to work with on this was Marcus Servilius, who apparently was deeply disloyal and also perhaps a bit of an oaf. Because Gaius had effectively allowed Servilius to take money while he was a legate in his province, and he had also bribed Servilius to put him on trial. And so when he asked Servilius to pay him back after Servilius's attempt at running a distraction failed, Servilius showed that he was actually not a creature of Gaius because he revealed the arrangement to everybody. So now Gaius was not only legally in trouble, but he was deeply embarrassed, and his character was now called into question. Not to mention that going into the trial, he was compromised because he had already tried and failed to weasel his way out. He was lucky that he wasn't just straight up ousted from the Senate and kicked out of town. But he was still assessed a heavy fine. Unfortunately for Gaius, he wasn't able to pay it, and so now he voluntarily entered into exile. Again, I have to stress, these were standard charges that happened to every governor. Most of them beat the charges, and Gaius largely failed to beat the charges simply because he chose to align himself with the wrong guy. After crossing the Rubicon and occupying Rome in 49, one of the first things that Caesar did was to publish a decree whereby all recent political exiles were welcomed home. They could resume their citizenship and membership in the Senate. For whatever reason, this did not help Gaius Claudius Pulcher. My only guess is that Caesar was most likely unwilling to allow him to just write off his debt. And so he was insisting that Gaius pay the debt. The reason I think that is because Caesar had a similar problem emerge with Servius Sulpicius Galba, one of his supporters, who asked to be relieved of having to repay a debt to Pompey. And even though Pompey was dead, Caesar said that he still had to pay the estate back. So it's possible that Caesar was a stickler for certain things, and perhaps Gaius just expected the debt to be discharged, but Caesar wasn't having that. So that could be what the issue was. But apparently this issue persisted for quite a while, as we'll see. In the meantime, later in 49, Appius, who had gone with Pompey to Greece, had taken up a governorship in Achaia, only to suddenly fall ill and die. And at the time, Appius had no living sons, and so in his will, he passed along his name and estate to Gaius' son, who now legally became Appius Claudius Pulcher, and he would now be able to not only be the standard bearer for the name, but to pass it on to his heirs. So all of the future men named Appius Claudius Pulcher were direct descendants of Gaius, and not Appius Claudius Pulcher, the man known for his arrogance and superstition. We do know that although the new Appius Claudius Pulcher was, legally speaking, the son of Appius, he still retained his warmth toward his birth father Gaius, and that he continued to fight on his behalf and ask for his homecoming. In 43, we know of at least one instance where Gaius approached Antony and asked him once more, implying that this had happened multiple times already, about his father potentially coming home. We don't know if Antony acceded to the request or not, but most likely, if he had already rejected it multiple times, he didn't change his mind this time either. So, whatever the reason was, neither Caesar nor Antony had a strong interest in allowing Gaius Claudius Pulcher to come home. So it's possible later that someone else, like Octavian, brought him back, but we don't know for sure. We also, of course, don't really understand exactly why these men didn't want him back, or what the deal was exactly. But at any rate, there's a very good chance that Gaius Claudius Pulcher died while still in exile. And if so, then that means that someone that everyone else in Rome had forgotten about died quietly. The real legacy of Gaius Claudius Pulcher is that his son and descendants became the new Appius Claudius Pulcher line. That's at least something. As for Gaius Claudius Pulcher, he is, of course, the least significant of the three brothers. His sister Clodia is also more famous and important than him. That being said, one of his brothers is Clodius, and being less significant than Clodius is not an insult. In terms of his personality, Gaius is a little bit hard to gauge. We don't really know a whole lot about the guy. He's certainly not as outstandingly arrogant as Appius, who was more or less the standard for arrogance in Rome at the time, nor was he as controversial and adventurous as Publius. He never broke into a festival for women, for instance, and he also never started a street gang. And so, when he's surrounded by these two outsized personalities, it's pretty easy to understand why Gaius was overlooked. It's even possible that he actually was a relatively interesting guy. It's just that he was outshone by being near these two megastars. So, that could be what the problem is. Or he could have been dull. We simply don't know. One of the big lessons of Gaius' career is that patricians can fall afoul of the law, but only if they are a combination of unlucky and weak. Gaius' problem is that, unlike Appius, he didn't know that as a very wealthy patrician he could simply shrug when accused of a serious crime, and it probably would go away. Appius famously was embroiled in the scandal for the consulship of 53, As the presiding consul, he and his colleague agreed to take bribes from the candidates, 2 of them at least, and when confronted with it, Appius basically just said, and then nothing happened. So presumably Gaius could have done something similar here. If he had just been an arrogant prick when put on trial, most likely he would have gotten away with it. He might have taken a little bit of a hit to his reputation, but most likely he would not have gotten into any legal trouble. So he simply was too incompetent to know what to do and how to be a patrician prick. There's a famous phrase that Jim Cornette said one time, and I'm not sure if he made it up or if he borrowed it from Kentucky, but what he said was that there are certain people in the world who are fence post turtles. People who you look at and you realize that there's absolutely no way they got to where they are on their own merits. And at the end of the day, I think Gaius Claudius Pulcher is the perfect example of a Roman fence post turtle. He clearly was not someone who would have been able to rise from obscurity to prominence. That being said, there are a lot more backbenchers in the Senate than stars. And make no mistake about it, this man is a backbencher. Although, the more I think about it, the more I think fence post turtle is probably the best 1-word or 2-word summary for what this guy is. So anyway, I've been Thersites the Historian. Thank you for listening, and I will see you around again in the near future with more Romans of renown and other video content.